Hello, my name is Michael Albert, and I'm the host of the podcast titled Revolution Z. Today's episode is episode 11, VisionStrategy, Class Rule or Classlessness. Before we start, I'd like to just make a very brief appeal. To do this podcast, to expand it so it has guests, to expand it so it can address questions from listeners online, we need to be supported. I'm hopeful that you will help with that. The way to do it is to visit the website titled www.patreon.com/revolutionz. From that page, you can hear more things about the podcast, see a little video intro to the podcast, and also, if you so choose, provide us some support as a patron. So now for episode 11. All varieties of social activists pay very close, but sometimes even too much or too exclusive attention to issues of class. At the same time, with peripheral exceptions, activist attention on class almost always focuses entirely on capitalists versus workers. The former own productive assets and earn profits. The latter sell their ability to do work to earn wages. The attention activists give the capitalist-worker face-off has led to powerful understandings of wage rates for workers and profit rates for owners, of the length of the workday and of the work week, of the direction of investment, and of the intensity and products of work. And all that is very good. Paying close attention to capitalist-worker relations has also helped explain much about unemployment and welfare policies, about ecological pollution and inadequate regulations, about the motives and character of schooling, about racial and gender income disparities, about intervention in war, and about political and cultural trends and relations. And all that is also very good. Capitalist-worker relations are thus hugely important, and for activists to pay attention to them is very wise. But two other results of not just paying attention to, but giving near exclusive attention to capitalist versus worker class relations are less helpful. Indeed, they are often even seriously harmful to seeking a better world. One such negative result has been downplaying and sometimes denying the equal centrality of race, gender, and power relations in determining societal outcomes. However, regarding overemphasizing economics at the expense of paying comparable attention to other key dimensions of social life, the good news is that over the past few decades, anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-authoritarian movements have accomplished so much that current activism only rarely suffers such narrow-mindedness. But the second result remains quite harmful. In the last 3 episodes of Revolution Z, 2 were on vision and 1 was on strategy, I have referred to an empowered coordinator class that is located above workers and below capitalists. Most socialists find this wrong-headed. They see people working on farms or in factories, people providing services or producing material commodities, people working in healthcare, in entertainment, or in government, people working for small businesses or for multinationals, and they deem them all workers. They also see mental and manual labor. They see white-collar and blue-collar labor, and they see them all as being in the working class. Indeed, they see the working class as everyone who doesn't own means of production. They see it as everyone who isn't a capitalist. Since the people I call coordinators sell their abilities to work to owners for wages, nearly all socialists see them as workers. Just as they see farm workers and industrial workers as being in the working class, so too they see coordinators and workers as being in the working class. They labor under different circumstances, agrees the socialist, but they have shared class interests and inclinations. So if that is what most people who emphasize the importance of class think, why do I instead see a third class between workers and owners? It is because I see that coordinators and workers' different circumstances give coordinators and workers systematically different mindsets, tastes, inclinations, and interests. Coordinators do largely empowering work. They are doctors, lawyers, engineers, managers, and accountants. Their work gives them skills, knowledge, confidence, and social size. Their work prepares them for decision-making. In contrast, workers do overwhelmingly disempowering work. They are assemblers, line cooks, drivers, and cleaners. Their work restricts their skills, depresses their knowledge, reduces their confidence, and isolates them in ways leaving them unsuited and disinclined to be involved in decision-making. Coordinators accrue much higher income than workers. They exert greater influence over decisions than workers. They have different habits, tastes, preferences, and interests than workers. Coordinators typically view workers as subordinate and even inferior. They administer, tend to, and make decisions about workers. They are typically paternalistic or just outright authoritarian toward workers. Workers, in contrast, have much lower income. They exert nearly no influence over decisions. They have different habits, tastes, preferences, and interests than coordinators. Workers typically view coordinators as aloof, elitist, and oppressive, but also as superior. They hope their kids can become part of the coordinator class, even as they also despise coordinators as people who they have to rely on and obey. Honestly, I think this is all pretty obvious. But if you don't yet agree, here is another facet of the situation to consider. Activists have historically fought over how they view past historical experiences that have called themselves socialist. Good, caring activists have been rightly horrified by various behaviors of these past experiences. They have often sought a non-socialist explanation for the harmful features because they want to avoid socialism being identified with the failings. Some activists have said the negative aspects or even the whole experiences were never socialist in the first place. They were instead state capitalist. Thus their flaws don't reflect on socialism itself. Other activists have said the experiences were once socialist, but were taken over by state officials. They became deformed socialism. Thus again, their flaws don't reflect on socialism itself. More recently, the whole experiences have been called 20th century socialism, meaning a bad kind to be avoided. Here is a very different view. First, we should not call experiences that have eliminated capitalists capitalist. That ought to be obvious. Second, to be consistent with virtually all socialist formulations about everything other than these past experiences, we should look at the experiences, Russia, China, etc., to see if they ever comprehensively sought classlessness. If they did, that would be in tune with socialist aspirations. Or were they instead from their outset always saddled with class division? If that's the case, then they were likely not socialist. Third, we should look to see if these self-labeled socialist experiences elevated a new non-capitalist ruling class. That would mean the experiences were not capitalist, but also not socialist. Once we undertake that agenda, we can easily see that the group of empowered workers that I have called the coordinator class became, in these past experiences, a new ruling class. That is, coordinators remained the economic actors who monopolize empowering tasks and operate above disempowered workers. Coordinator circumstances still came firstly from the corporate division of labor, and that division of labor was preserved and not eliminated. There were also many associated familial, educational, governmental, and other supporting features of those experiences. Coordinator circumstances still came firstly from the corporate division of labor. It was that division of labor that gave them only empowered work, or mostly empowered work, and that gave the workers below mostly disempowering work. And that division of labor was preserved, not eliminated, in those experiences that we're talking about, that call themselves socialist. Coordinators' relation to workers below them also stayed essentially unchanged, but with coordinators' ultimate authority enhanced due to the removal of capitalists. That is, coordinators continued to define and administer workers' life experiences in these situations that we called socialist. They continued to view workers either paternalistically or downright dismissively. What did change was that in the absence of owners, the coordinator class was no longer subordinate to a more powerful capitalist economic class above. Instead, coordinators became the topmost economic class. Capitalists were gone, but workers were not in command. With this view, if we mean by socialism an equitable economy which workers self-manage, then the Soviet experience, as but one example, was not socialist despite designating itself as such. It also wasn't state capitalist. It wasn't deformed socialist. It wasn't 20th century socialist. It was instead economically coordinatorist. But if a group in society, defined by its position in the economy, can become the group ruling the economy, as in these experiences, it certainly makes sense in any consistent approach to call that group a class. Big deal, you might say. Beyond academic or ideological nitpicking, why does this issue of highlighting capitalist versus worker, or instead highlighting capitalist versus coordinator versus worker, actually matter? What difference does it make? One key reason that it matters is if the three-class view is right, then movements can overcome capitalism and leave coordinators as a new ruling class. But if that is true, then actions, campaigns, projects, and movements that seek to overcome capitalism and which also want to attain classlessness need to avoid becoming vehicles of a continuing coordinator class presence above workers. If the three-class view is correct, then movements seeking classlessness need to become vehicles that steadily reduce coordinator sway and that ultimately challenge and replace the sources of coordinator class rule. But in that case, the coordinator-worker dynamic is something movements seeking to move toward worker self-management will need to address, as they also seek to alter schooling and on-the-job training and challenge coordinator prerogatives, and finally to alter the definition of jobs and thereby overcome the corporate division of labor by moving toward balanced job complexes. Attending to our altered understanding of class should therefore become a very important part of seeking equity, self-management, and classlessness. Looked at from a different angle, if the three-class view is correct, an anti-capitalist movement, organization, or project can truly express and elevate working-class interests, or it can only claim to be doing that, but actually be largely or even wholly expressing and elevating coordinator class interests. In other words, a movement can say that it's anti-capitalist, can be anti-capitalist, but cannot be pro-working class elevation to control of society. It would instead favor coordinator class rule. More, I claim this has occurred repeatedly in history. Still more, I claim workers have a very good eye for the difference. And even more, I claim workers often harbor great hostility for the coordinator class and for its arrogance and paternalism. And finally, I claim this hostility often plays a role in how workers relate to social programs and campaigns. Some workers, for example, will support a program in workers' interest even if it comes with off-putting coordinator class values, manners, styles, and leadership preponderant. They'll join a movement, they'll fight for changes, even if they have to follow coordinator leadership, even if the movement that they're in is infused with coordinator manners and styles. Other workers, however, will rebel so forcefully against a program's coordinatorish aspects or leadership, or even just its coordinator tone, that they will doubt or ignore the policy gains they might enjoy. They won't join, or they'll join, but then leave. And yes, I believe that this kind of reaction explains much working-class hostility toward many social movements for peace, ecological sustainability, and even for economic equity, and that it also played a significant role in the working-class support that went and still goes toward Trump. Let me give an example from actually the 1980s when the No Nukes movement was very powerful. People were organizing in movements like anti-war movements, but they were no nuke movements. They were organizing to try and shut down nuclear power plants for fear of the dangers of those plants. And those movements would hold demonstrations, hold rallies, even try to hold occupations to oppose nuclear power. And many nuclear power workers, and many workers outside of the nuclear plants, became hostile to those movements. And the reason that occurred, I believe, was not because all those workers thought nuclear power was just great, that the dangers were nil, they weren't real. It was because the movements exuded a kind of coordinatorist attitude and mentality. Now, some who were involved might take issue with this, but let me give one example. These movements would often talk about the horrendous danger of a nuclear meltdown and of what a nuclear meltdown would cost in terms of human lives and ill health that would follow. And they would argue that this made a case against nuclear power. They wouldn't talk about the dangers of black lung disease to workers who were coal mining. They wouldn't talk about the health effects and the damage done by other forms of energy. Why was that? Why were the possible dangers of nuclear power highlighted and the actual, current, ongoing dangers of other approaches, for instance coal mining, not mentioned? For workers, it was because the movement didn't care about workers. It cared about neighborhoods in the vicinity of nuclear power plants, but it didn't care about workers off working in coal mines. Now you may say, oh, but of course the people in those movements cared about those workers. But what we're talking about here is the experience of working people encountering movements or efforts or projects that are led by and that are infused with coordinator class assumptions. Another example would be the Trump election campaign. Trump's a billionaire. Trump's an archetype capitalist, not to mention that he's a misogynistic thug. But he got a lot of working class support. Why was that? Was it because workers investigated Trump's past and his politics and his actions and decided he was a tribune of the working class? I don't think so. But I do think it had a lot to do, not in all cases, but in many cases, with working class hostility to coordinator class vibes, dynamics, process, behavior, which Hillary Clinton represented, which for them, Hillary Clinton was an exemplar of. And so when Trump acted sort of buffoonish, and when he lied, and when he put on airs, and when he said he would help working people, a lot of working people wanted to believe it. A lot of working people wanted to believe something good would come from a Trump election. And they knew that for them, not much good would come from a Clinton election. So they supported Trump. I don't think this is new either. This goes all the way back in time. Probably the biggest electoral example that I encountered in an early time was by someone who was Vice President Spyro Agnew. He used to talk about bullet-headed liberals. He used to rail against intelligentsia, the intellectual class, he called it, if I remember correctly. And it was all about coordinatorism. Of course, it was total hypocrisy because, in fact, he was a member of the coordinator class or the ruling class, the capitalist class. But it was useful, and this is often used. Working class antipathy toward coordinators often exceeds how workers dislike owners for a very simple reason. Most workers never directly encounter an owner, but most workers very frequently encounter coordinator doctors, lawyers, managers, accountants, and others. They directly feel the paternal arrogance and authoritarian dominance of many coordinators. They don't feel, not directly, not personally, behavior from owners. They are at a distance. Constructively addressing the coordinator-worker interface, while welcoming coordinators to participate in movements that, however, are worker-led, becomes a clear priority once we have a three-class view. Succinctly put, an economic class is a group of people who, by virtue of their position in the economy, have broadly shared views, inclination, and interests, and in particular are at odds with other such groups and can be either subordinate to them or authoritative toward them. The class is a group. It affects the mindsets, the skills, the knowledge, the dispositions, the inclinations of its members, and it can exist either above or beneath other groups, other classes. In our view, then, class can arise from ownership relations. Of course, we know that in the case of owners, capitalists, but it can also arise from position in the division of labor. And while class isn't the only thing that matters, it is one thing that certainly matters greatly. Last episode, we focused on strategic issues bearing on the size of movements. We can now return to one aspect of that we can call the class problem. When the Women of Bread and Roses, an early feminist organization in the U.S. in the 1960s, said to the anti-war movement, "Clean up your act or you won't succeed," they were right. When the Black Power component of the civil rights struggle at around the same time, actually a little bit earlier, said to the anti-war movement, "Clean up your own house or you won't succeed," they were right. These observations were not only urging ending racism and sexism in society, they knew we had to end racial and sexual hierarchies inside our movements even sooner, much sooner. They knew that if we didn't, our movements would be hypocritical and uninspiring. If we didn't, our movements would suffer the ills of these oppressions themselves. If we didn't, our movements would not attract, much less empower, women, people of color, and other oppressed groups. And if we didn't, our movements wouldn't even retain broader anti-racist and anti-patriarchal priorities. This was the race and gender instance of the more general oppression-frustration problem mentioned last episode. And most activists understand these issues for racism and sexism and understand the associated strategic logic and try to act on it. However, we are also for ending economic injustice and class hierarchy in society. And so just as we can see that we need to end racial and gender hierarchies and movements, we should be able to see that we also need to end class hierarchies in our movements. We need to patiently, calmly, and constructively restructure our movements so that they no longer replicate corporate. We need to patiently, calmly, and constructively restructure our movements. We need them to no longer replicate corporate divisions of labor. We need them to not include hierarchies of decision-making, and we need them to reject market norms of remuneration. This must become a patient but unrelenting priority if we are to avoid class-centered hypocrisy, and if we are to avoid our movements becoming vehicles for coordinator class rule. It must also become a priority if we are to become economically inspiring, and we must do it to avoid suffering class alienation ourselves. And in tune with last episode's emphasis on movement size and movement's abilities to retain members, we have to challenge and overcome class hierarchy in our movements if we are to attract working people, if we are to empower working people, and if we are to retain working people and our economic justice priorities. In this view, class, which at various times in history has wrongly crowded race, gender, and sexual identity off movement agendas, now needs to be re-highlighted. It shouldn't be exclusively highlighted, and it should be highlighted in ways that address not only the ills of capital, such as poverty and inequality, but also the ills of decision monopolizing coordinators, such as their excess power and income and their arrogance, and it should highlight the related positive needs of labor, including for dignity and self-management. However, instead of battling coordinator elitism, many of our movements are largely coordinator-ish. Just as once, instead of battling the ills of racism and sexism, our movements were largely racist and sexist. And here is the related strategic insight. Our movements don't attract, empower, and hold working people nearly as effectively as they need to, for the same reason that movements disdainful of gender or race don't attract and hold women and members of minority cultural communities nearly as effective as they need to. Put differently, the issue of class and social change has been, for many years, seen as just a matter of us versus them. We were labor, they were capital. Each side might have members coming from the other by background, but the two sides were the only really important class teams one could join. Of course, individual people weren't personally homogenized into precisely two positions. Situations were more varied at the personal level. But collectively, when thinking in terms of overall prospects, class has been seen as bipolar. In contrast, the message of our new class analysis is that we need to reject a two-class formulation. When thinking about who are agents of change, and especially when thinking about how to reach out to and retain new members opposed to class injustices, we have to take into account that there is a coordinator class between labor and capital. And it isn't just that there is a third consequential group. Anyone can see many groups among the people labeled capital and among the people labeled labor. There are big capitalists and little ones. There are industrial and financial ones, and so on. There are organized workers and unorganized ones. There are employed and unemployed ones, skilled and unskilled ones, and so on. Rather, the point is that a movement can advocate on behalf of capital, a movement can advocate on behalf of labor, or a movement can instead advocate on behalf of a third class between those two, the coordinator class. In other words, there exists an economy elaborating the interests of each of the three classes as its central logic, not only an economy for two of them. The strategic problem is therefore to develop a movement whose program, structure, and practices lead toward a truly classless future, rather than toward a coordinator-dominated future. It turns out that it isn't enough that many people want classlessness. Most rank and file in every past revolution wanted classlessness. Rank and file activists in the Soviet Union wanted classlessness. Movements can want desirable outcomes, but have their aspirations violated by harmful choices along the way. People take over a workplace. They want self-management, but they retain the corporate division of labor, and it subverts their aims. People build an anti-war or a feminist organization. They implement formal participation and even self-management. They seek support for a program. but they adopt a culture and style and apportion tasks more like what you would expect at Yale Law School than in a working class-led project. Their coordinator style subverts their outreach. Attaining classlessness must be built into the logic of what people do and what they construct, not just into their rhetoric. This requires not only that we create movement institutions that are structurally in accord with classlessness, being careful about, for example, how our movements divide up tasks, but our desires for classlessness must also have a more personal dimension. If we question many typical activists, with some exceptions of course, we would often find a widespread disdain for religion and for most sports. Try asking campus activists, for example, about NASCAR or bowling, much less about football in the U.S., and watch the incredulous, dismissive reaction. Activists also disparage most TV shows, country and Western music, as well as most restaurants where working people eat and most newspapers that working people read. I was once giving a talk at a campus in Pennsylvania. It's called State College, Pennsylvania, and the college there was one of the biggest football schools in the country. In fact, the coach was one of the most revered and respected football coaches in the country. So I was giving this talk to an audience of about 400 students. And when they came in and sat down and I was up on the stage, I said, can I just ask you a few questions to get a feel for who's here? Everybody said, sure. I asked a few innocuous questions, and then I asked, how many of you have been to a football game? 2 hands went up, and they were both black. And 398 hands didn't go up. And I'm not kidding about this. This really happened. College Park in Pennsylvania is a city, or a town city, with about 60,000 people. On Saturdays, when there's a football game, a home football game for the university, not only do 60,000 people show up, but more. The stadium is filled and it's huge. The city virtually shuts down. And yet, in this group of leftists on the campus, activist, committed people concerned to make a better and a classless economy, nobody goes to the football games. If I had been talking to any other constituency on that college campus, the number of hands that would have gone up for having gone to a football game would be huge. In many cases, it would be everyone. Among women, it would be mostly everyone, or nearly so. It just wouldn't matter what constituency, except the leftists, except that activist group. And others feel that. They feel that what they are celebrating and doing is being not just not attended, but disdained. And that kind of dynamic drives away potential working class members. And it's also not warranted. In other words, many leftists adopt daily preferences that are not only different from, but that routinely disparage working people. Indeed, this is a large part of what is called political correctness. Not all of it, but a large part. There are additional factors case by case, but overall, not seeing that these attitudes are significant derives from our having not yet comprehended that coordinator elitism is as prevalent as capitalist, racist, or sexist elitism. It is also what allows emissaries of capitalism, even actual archetype capitalists like Trump, to gain support from workers. Trump appeals to working-class hostility to coordinator-class behavior in history, including the liberal politics like that of the Clintons. Decades back, I was always confused, to give another example, but then amazed and finally critical, when anti-capitalist activists would tell me how the working class, by its circumstances, was made wise to the ills of society and eager for fundamental change. They would tell how workers are the vanguard. They are the wise who we should follow. But minutes later, they would rail at working-class anti-communism and anti-movement inclinations as stupid and manipulated. They would never once consider that maybe worker hostility to much leftism was wise and warranted, not dumb or merely manipulated. They would never consider that maybe there was something about left activism that was off-putting to workers, rightly so, that their perception was wise. Activists need to understand how people trying to carve out reasonably fulfilling situations in tightly constrained settings can highly value commodities and practices that other people living in different situations utterly disdain. It is partly that sometimes many options are excluded by costs or accessibility. It is partly that some options are made highly accessible or even essential. We tend to gravitate toward those that are more available. Why, for example, do many young black boys, and now often girls too, think that playing basketball makes more sense than reading books? Is this genetic? Obviously not. It is partly due to structural channeling, and those who are channeled are not doing anything stupid in making their choices, nor are they merely being tricked. They, in fact, see reality and act reasonably in light of what they see. The better choice to fight for change seems hopeless, so they don't opt for that. Why do leftists decry the New York Times as a horrendous lying machine and then examine it for hours each day? And worse, ridicule those who instead opt to read only a tabloid sports section, the one section that doesn't lie. Is this wisdom or is it self-delusion? When the left is hostile to, critical of, fast food restaurants, is it just because they are not ecologically sound? Is it just because they are capitalist institutions? Or is it partly because they cater to a working class environment? Once we open our eyes to seeing how a classist movement can make working people feel alienated, just like a racist or sexist movement can make blacks, Latinos, or women feel alienated, the relation of all this to the stickiness problem, which is movements failing to retain members, is obvious. Walking down the street decades ago, and sometimes now too, a white person expects a black person to step aside. Similarly, a coordinator class person strolling along expects deference from a working class person. My point is, if a movement doesn't attract and hold enough working people, it is typically because its projects, organizations, and campaigns are not welcoming and empowering for working people. The assumed deference remains at play. The movements embody coordinator class tastes, values, behaviors, and structures. Imagine an anti-racist movement mimicking the structure and culture of a southern slave plantation, and ask yourself, would that be attractive for blacks? Would blacks who did join stay long? Now extrapolate to class and the way some movement institutions mimic divisions of labor and distributions of circumstance, income, and power. Of course, they are not attractive for workers. The good news, however, is there is a clear path forward. Build movements for fundamental economic, kinship, cultural, political change, which appeal to all potential agents of change, and which are able to retain who they attract, and which are able to act in the present in light of and propelling their desires for the future. We will highlight these tasks in coming strategy-focused episodes of Revolution Z. We have in our sequence of vision-centered episodes so far advocated implementing incomes for duration, intensity, and onerousness of socially valued work to achieve equity. We have advocated utilizing workers' assemblies with diverse decision-making methods to attain self-management. We have advocated adopting balanced job complexes to avoid class division and to ensure full decision-making participation. These are three fundamental institutional goals, but they are not the whole economic story we have to address before moving on to issues beyond economy. There is one more key aspect of economic life to address, called allocation. It is what determines how much of this or that is produced and where it all winds up. It turns out that a project can successfully pursue our equity, self-management, and participation innovations, but still have its whole remarkable local achievement undone by a poor choice of how to allocate among workplaces and consumers. So that will be the focus next episode. For now, however, please consider visiting our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/revolutionz. There you can become a patron of our podcast. In that way, you can help us expand Revolution Z to 3 episodes a week. You can help us involve guests in those episodes, and you can help us assemble questions from listeners and provide answers from myself and guests in those episodes. Every little pledge helps. In fact, we only need another $300 to meet our first goal of $1,000 of support per month. So this is Michael Albert, helping you consider that possibility and signing off for Revolution Z until next time.